Is a consortium of 10 European NGOs who harness people power to reduce emissions, for example, by doing research and advocacy, but also by organizing events like these. It's a program funded by the European Union LIFE program and by the European Climate Foundation. The topic of our first panel discussion today is the implementation and introduction of the CBAM, the Border Adjustment Mechanism. I'm going to say it once. And it's supposed to be introduced right now and be fully in effect in 2026. How will theory pan out in reality? And what is necessary for a proper implementation of the system? That's what we will discuss today. I will quickly take you through the agenda. We will start with a 50-minute introduction. It's a presentation on the foreseen impact of the EU CBAM, and then we will move on to the panel discussion. After that, there will be ample opportunity for you to ask any of your questions until we wrap up around 1, and then we go to lunch. Our second panel on the ETS2 and the Social Climate Fund that is coming with that, that will start at 2 o'clock sharp. Just one last announcement. Some of you will have a lot of knowledge about the EU ETS and others will be relatively new to this. So therefore we aim to avoid any jargon or go too deep into the subject matter. I will try and summarize for you as well. But if anything is unclear and you want to ask a question during the panel discussion of clarification in the room, just raise your hand. And online, you can either discuss amongst yourselves in the chat, or you can ask a question directed at Lisanne. She will put all the instructions for that in the chat. Now, I would like to introduce you to our first presenters of today. I'm Lidia from Sandbach, who will kick off for us today with a presentation on the CBAM, together with Lydia from Carbon Market Watch. Lidia Tamellini, I'm sorry. Welcome, Amerik and Lydia, and thank you for being here today. The floor is yours. Oh, yes. Lydia will start with a very short introduction on the CBAM, and then Amerik will take over.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Yurin, and thanks everyone for being here. Yes, I will start with our presentation, maybe. Of course, this is the very first event of the day, so we have to flatten out the technical details as we go. Yes, here we go. Yes, indeed. So we wanted to work out what the state of play is. As Yurin mentioned, not everybody in the room or online has the same knowledge of where the EU CBAM is at the moment. I would like to really maybe give a bit of context of where we're at. Not too basic, but again, not too deep into the details. So I wanted to start doing the why a CBAM. Things have changed a lot since the presentation of the CBAM, actually back in 2021, and when it was presented by the Commission. At the time, it was really a carbon leakage protection instrument. It was presented to offer further protection to certain sectors deemed at high risk of carbon leakage. I could dwell way deeper into that as to what we consider to be carbon leakage and why do we need to define it better and to dwell into the data a bit better. But maybe we can discuss this more during the panel discussion. Again, back in 2021, it really allowed a way out for the free allocation of allowances in the EU ETS. As you surely all well know, certain sectors under the EU ETS still receive a big chunk. The majority, actually, of their emission allowances are covered by the system of free allocation. And thanks to the CBAM, there was common ground to manage to phase out all the free allocation for all these sectors. Of course, we could also argue that this was a way for the free allocation system to last even longer than it was initially foreseen. Another time, finally, EU industry and EU industrial sector, again, at high risk of carbon leakage especially, were strongly in favor of the CBAM and pushed for it even before its publication. But again, time has changed. We're now in 2024. A lot happened in between. The geopolitical equilibrium changed a lot. And we know that global economies are moving their attention inward. So as the US and China become more, again, their efforts focus inward, the CBAM has also been challenged in international fora as protectionist. This happened especially at WTO level, at COP and beyond. And thinking, of course, of China, of India, we know that now at WTO level, India has filed an official compliant. So the thinking around the CBAM has changed as well. The Commission is now pushing it as also a climate diplomacy instrument, which is very interesting. We also know that a new task force has been launched. Maybe we'll also have the chance to discuss this further, to leverage the CBAM as a system to nudge other economies into establishing their own carbon pricing systems. Now, EU industries have a bit more of an ambivalent view on this. They're not as strongly pushing for it anymore, quite the opposite in many, many cases. Why? They're worried of price increases. They're worried maybe their own products, especially if they're multinational operating in multiple countries, they are worried about the effects of the CBAM on their own markets and on their own production. And finally, now I don't want to say the buzzword, but really the discussion nowadays in the past months have really been all around industrial competitiveness. And I think that the CBAM has not been leveraged nearly enough in the latest discussion, in the latest policy developments. I'm thinking even in terms of the Council conclusion in terms for industrial competitiveness. One notable exception that I wanted to point out is the report by Enrico Letta on the internal market that really dwells into the CBAM as an instrument to protect European industry and beyond. So I will really invite you to read the report if you haven't had the chance yet. And I really, of course, invite all policymakers and stakeholders to consider to take the CBAM into consideration within the conversation around industrial competitiveness. EU industry needs to be protected, but of course, we want to consider a CBAM as an instrument that goes way beyond protecting European industry. It is a nudge. It is an instrument that allows us to raise climate ambition all over the world. So maybe now that we have a bit of context, yes, the state of play. The adoption was, you'll know, back in May in 2023, and now just a few months back in October, the start of the 2-year monitoring period started, ahead of the actual kick-in of the system. But in between now and the actual phase-in in January 2026, we will have some opportunities to still review the actual regulation. I just mentioned 2 main moments, but far more implementing acts and delegated acts are foreseen, as well as reports on more technical issues, such as the inclusion of more downstream goods, or a general report on the functioning of the CBAM. So we will have an opportunity to for technical amendments to the CBAM regulation, and most importantly, policy amendments to the CBAM regulation, both in 2025. These are key moments ahead of the phase-in, because we have a lot of questions still to be answered. I've just pointed out a few, there's way more, as you can imagine. The amount of implementing acts and delegated acts still to be drafted, reviewed and approved is quite staggering. But I wanted to point out a few things that rightfully worried industry and industry, policymaker, trade partners alike. We don't quite know how we will calculate embedded emissions in products. Of course, there is an idea. We have a calculation system for the transitional period, and we are expecting an implementing act in Q2 of 2025. Second point, also very important, how will the carbon price paid in production countries will be taken into account? We know that the carbon price effectively paid in production country will be taken off, the import tax, but what is an effective carbon price? We do not have an answer to that yet, and the guidelines are still pretty vague. On this, also an implementing act coming in 2025. Third point, we will surely touch upon broadly during the panel. How will the revenues be spent? We don't know that yet. There are no indications properly set in the regulation. We know that there's a proposal for a no resource for them to be. We know that the revenues will be mostly will be used for the own resources of the EU, and the rest will be distributed among member states, but we don't know how from the own resources those will be spent. Of course, at Carbon Market Watch, we have a clear idea that we're happy to discuss. Finally, social justice and just transition in general. How do we ensure less developed countries and vulnerable economies won't be disproportionately affected by this instrument? On this, America, I'm sure, will be able to give more insight on how different economies can be affected by this tool. We have also we wanted to give a bit of an introduction of scope and functioning. I don't know how to what extent it is needed. I feel the crowd, at least in the room, is quite knowledgeable about the topic. But in terms of scope, we know that the CBAM currently covers 6 sectors and several downstream products connected to the precursor sector. So we're talking of iron and steel, fertilizers, cement, electricity, hydrogen at the moment, and aluminium. And the way it will work is in a way similar to the ETS, as in 1 ton of CO2 equals 1 allowance, but they will have to be surrendered at the border, basically during the import phase. They won't be tradable, and it will have a duration, as we know at the moment, of 2 years. So maybe without going into further detail on the functioning, we can start talking about the impacts a bit more. And I'll call Emmerich on stage.
Hi, hello. Sorry, just a very quick technical issue since you were not looking at the latest version of the presentation. Some very last minute fixes to the presentation, as you can see. But yeah, I'll pick it up from here. Thank you, Lidia. Thank you for the invitation as well. I'm very happy to be here. Lydia and I, work together very frequently, as well as other people in this room and online. So you've already had a quick snapshot of what we do on this slide, which shouldn't appear, but it's completely fine. So we're a non-profit climate think tank. Sandbag, you may have heard of us. I don't think we're very well known outside of the bubble of carbon pricing and industrial decarbonisation. Inside the bubble, I'd like to think that we are. We have a close relationship with the Commission, as you can see. We're in different expert groups. We've been working on the ETS for the past 16 years or so, and the CBAM since it was conceptualized. I really want to show you the new slides. Meanwhile, I can start with this. So part of our work on the CBAM is fairly technical. We tend to be very data-driven in what we do. We produced a fairly comprehensive report in 2021 with E3G, another climate think tank, that was looking at the impacts of the CBAM, in particular for China. So as reports will show, we were exploring the issue of impacts for trading partners in particular. Oh, you've seen it just there for a second. Top right, I think. Apologies for that. There we go, I think. Yes, wow. Right, we can go to the next slide already. If you can. Yeah. All right. So if you look at the next slide in a second, what our report in 2021 showed. So that report was produced quite a few months after the proposal was made by the Commission, but still around August, I think, 2021. Next slide, if you can. And that first report in 2021 already showed that. There we go. There were still some issues that had to be addressed with the CBAM, that were far from a smooth implementation. Second, that interestingly, that the impact of the CBAM on imports of Chinese goods would be very limited. Three main reasons for that. One, the scope of the CBAM is fairly limited. Two, there's a 10-year phase-in of the system. So the CBAM, the full CBAM charges are only applicable from 2034 onwards. And finally, some of the costs would be passed down directly to consumers, which obviously reduces the impact for both exporters and importers. So this new report now, 2024, was launched last week. You may have heard about it also in the press, if that's one of the topics you're following. And here, sorry, you can't see the bottom there. We updated our analysis with the new information we had on the rules, but also with new data. And we wanted to go a bit further than the previous one, so we explored these questions through different scenarios. Three scenarios that you can see on the screen. The business as usual scenario, which is just the normal perfect implementation of the CBAM. So no changes in trade patterns, but everything is applied correctly. The second scenario is perhaps the most interesting one. It's resource shuffling. So it's a process where basically some producers may be able to circumvent the CBAM altogether. There's still a couple, well, more than a couple, a few loopholes in the CBAM that need to be addressed. One big one on the issue of scrap, which we've been very vocal about, and has massive implications for trade patterns. So if, and this is a hypothetical if I insist, if exporters in those countries abuse of the system and abuse of those loopholes to completely circumvent the system, this is what we'll try to show you in the next couple of figures. So yeah, it's just sort of good to bear in mind what happens if the system doesn't work. And the last scenario here, the no reporting scenario, is the one where there's either missing information or the CBAM charges are applied inaccurately. The reporting is done inaccurately. And by doing so, that means that we apply the default values to the exports. So here are findings. So the report focuses mainly on China, but we also have figures on other countries, and you're more than welcome to contact me after the presentation if you want more data. So this is perhaps one of the really interesting ones that we sort of found. So at the top, the sort of darker blue, black line you can see there, that represents the CBAM fees. So top right, so we've got business as usual scenario. So this is normal CBAM application. The second one's resource shifting. Third one, no reporting. So as you can expect, the CBAM fees are greater if you fail to report accurately your emissions, because then we've assigned the default values to your exports, therefore more expensive. The grey bar just underneath represents the proportion of costs that you would, in essence, recuperate. So sort of fine again by selling your products. This is the difference, right? So the lighter blue bar at the bottom shows you the net CBAM cost, if I dare call it that way. And here, something perhaps interesting, you can see that in the resource shifting scenario, importers of Chinese goods would be making a profit of 32 million euros. So that's just to show that, I mean, two things. One, the system is not perfect and it still contains some risks, and that can result in some profits for importers of goods. And that means one thing for importers, but also means something else for EU industries that are competing with those importers. Those EU industries with the phase-out of free allowances will be selling their goods at a higher price, right? But that means that importers of Chinese goods in this case can sell their products at exactly the same price and make a bigger profit because they've imported their goods at a cheaper price, hence the profit you can see there. The other information I wanted to point out here is that the numbers we're showing here are still fairly small. Really, when we're talking about 250, 350 million euros, this is peanuts for Chinese exports to Europe. And this is what the next slide will show you. We wanted to sort of really show, hang on, we keep hearing about the CBAM as this big, massive thing that will penalize every country outside Europe. But actually, what are we talking about? And here you see that, in fact, it barely sort of, represents anything for China. China doesn't have to care about the EU CBAM. Admittedly, some sectors are more affected than others. But that's not to say that, basically they can live without it, with it, they'll be fine. So yeah, a couple more figures here, but I want to run to the next one so that I'm not taking too much time. Just to show that this also applies to other countries and not just China, even though that's what the report mostly focuses on. Here I've put the, again, one of the most interesting figures we have in the report, which shows you what I've just explained, right? So you've got on the left the CBAM fees, on the right the net CBAM cost, so that's when you deduce the benefits you make by selling those products, right? So you show here that the impacts on China are limited, like I said, even more limited for partners who have low emission standards, because we've here incorporated specific data for every of those countries. So that reflects the power sector, etc., etc. So the US are pretty well here, South Korea as well, etc., etc. Russia here is more affected and differently with or without the sanctions. Yeah, and then at the bottom here is the resource shuffling scenario. So that's when the loopholes are not addressed and exporters can circumvent the system altogether. So China would not be the only one to make a profit here. That also applies to Turkey and South Korea, for example. Next slide. Thank you. So I'll conclude there because I'm really eager to hear what the panelists have to say about all this and sort of where do we take this forward. There's still, I mean, we're a climate think tank, there's still a huge climate benefit to the CBAM. What we're saying is not less CBAM, it's more CBAM, it's better CBAM, stronger CBAM. So it's already mentioned by Lidia, but the CBAM will enable the phase out of free allowances in the ETS, roughly 43–45% up to 50%. So that's a huge thing already. Why? Because that finally encourages those EU industries to decarbonize and faster. That's not to say that they won't receive any free allowances. There's still some free allowances in the system for the sectors that are not covered by the CBAM or for precursors that were not included in the CBAM. But yeah, so I think the point of the report is to show that the impact of the CBAM on trading partners is fairly limited and much more limited than it's often portrayed. Therefore, that the fears of the EU CBAM should be contained, if possible. And in fact, we're showing that the EU is taking a big risk with the CBAM. So the risky, the one most at threat here may be the EU more than third countries. But that can be fixed. There's loopholes that can be addressed. And the CBAM is a good thing that needs to be strengthened and increased. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention and apologies for the little hiccup at the beginning. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily, for the presentation. Please stay here for a little bit because I want to check if there are any questions specifically for Emily, like questions of clarification or other questions you can keep until after the panel discussion. And the last slide again. The last slide again, if we can see that one again. Yes. So did you also have an accompanying question or just you wanted to see the slide again? Well, that's easily fixed. So now I'm going to go to my tablet, not to check my messages, or actually to check my messages, because if there are any questions from online, I get them here. Just a second. Not yet? Well, then I put my tablet away again. Thank you. If you could have a seat. Where are my... Because then we are going to move on to our panel discussion. It is time to turn to our panelists. Joining us are Sara Svensson. Please come and have a seat here. Policy analyst for the think tank ERCST, the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. She is joined by Niall O'Hare from the cement company Ecocem. Have a seat there. Oh yeah, sorry. I always leave my stuff everywhere. Give me that. Yes. Thank you. And then there is Romain Laugier, policy officer in the CBAM team at the European Commission. And then we have, of course, we already know her, Lidia Tamellini, policy advisor at Carbon Market Watch. All right, yes. Have a seat, have a drink, and have a very warm welcome here. We're very happy that you're here. We will discuss whether or not the CBAM will help decarbonize Europe's heavy industry while protecting it from unfair competition across the globe. But can CBAM make the world greener? And more importantly, will it deliver on its promises in the current setup? This and more we will discuss in the next about 40 minutes. Sara Svensson, I would like to start with you. How long have you been working on CBAM already? Oh, right, yes. I'm gonna, so you turn on the, yes.
Hello.
Okay, we learned something. They cannot be on all at once. Go ahead.
Hello. Yes.
It's still ringing. That is strange. Yeah, just stay mine.
Okay, great. No ringing now. Yes, my name is Sara, and I work at the ERCST, which you introduced with the full name, so I don't have to say it all again. We're a think tank in Brussels, working on mainly EU climate policy, mainly focused on carbon pricing, the EU ETS, CBAM, also work on CCUS and hydrogen, and also some more international issues. And I joined a year and a half ago and have been focusing only on CBAM, but also on climate and trade more in general. So also having a more international perspective on climate and trade issues and how you can combine them.
I'm gonna try. No, it doesn't want to go on the same time. So if you can push the button and then I can turn it on. Thank you for that. That's just a short introduction so everybody knows who you are and who you work for. Niall O'Hare, I'm going to do the same for you. Your company Ecocem works on low carbon cement production. How big a topic is CBAM at your office?
Yes, so CBAM is a pretty big topic for us. So just to give you a sense of who we are and what we do, so Ecocem produces low carbon cement. And I'll tell you what the difference is between cement and concrete, just so we know, because cement isn't a topic that a lot of people read about in their spare time. So cement is the powder that you mix with gravel and sand to make concrete that's all around us. So, and concrete that's made from cement is the most consumed substance on Earth after water. So that means there's a lot of cement produced. Globally, about 4 billion tons of cement are produced per annum. And the average CO2 per ton of cement is about 620 kg. So if you multiply it out, you're looking at about 2.6 billion tons of CO2 per annum, which puts cement about, if it was a country, it would be third after China and the US. It's about the equivalent of India in terms of emissions. So it's a pretty significant issue. And at Ecocem, we produce low carbon cements, and we've been doing so for about 20 years now. We sell about 2.5 million tons into about 7 markets in Western Europe. And we are dedicated to developing low carbon solutions. And we put about 20% of our staff into research and development. And we know the potential and the ability of low carbon cement to decarbonize the cement sector. And we as a company firmly believe that the cement sector in Europe can halve its emissions by 2030 using technology and processes that are available today. So we see CBAM as kind of the first critical step in moving the industry down the road of decarbonisation. So it's a major topic for us, major issue of interest. But again, we're in the early stages of it. We're still in the transition period. Trying to understand CBAM beyond 2026 and the impacts, we're still trying to learn. But I don't think there's any doubt that CBAM is going to create a financial incentive for the cement industry to decarbonise. And that's something that we are looking at very closely.
Thank you for that. I'm moving on to Romain Laugier. You are part of the CBAM team at the Directorate General for Taxations and Customs Union. I think it's mostly this one, isn't it? It doesn't really matter if you're on or not. Yeah, okay. Well, you're going to hear some nice ringing when I speak. It's where you work is abbreviated to GG TAXUD. I know that DG, that's for Directorate General, but TAXUD, could you briefly explain to us what the Directorate does and what aspects of CBAM you focus on in your team?
Yes, thank you very much. So I started at the European Commission in TAXUD last year. It's not a prime DG when you work on environment, climate issues, but it started being one when they started working on this file called CBAM, which we're discussing right now. So the main business of the DG is to work on taxation, on imports of goods in general. They have a lot of IT knowledge as well, because whatever happens when a product enters the EU is subject to a lot of controls, IT controls. And that felt like the natural home for the CBAM, because the CBAM applies to imports. And when you need to set up a system, obviously you need a lot of administrative competences. And the CBAM is one of the first areas G works on green aspects. So we also work on taxations and greening taxations. We have discussions on legislation on the Energy Taxation Directive, which is also considered green. And then we have the CBAM. So I think this DG is now profiling itself a little bit more, probably as all the DGs after the European Green Deal, on climate issues. So that might answer your question.
Yeah, for me, that explains it perfectly. Thank you. Then Lidia, we already heard from you a little bit. Carbon Market Watch has been the driving force in the consortium of NGOs that organizes these carbon pricing hubs. What makes the CBAM stand out in the EU ETS toolbox for you?
Thanks. Good question. And well, actually, maybe I will take the occasion to thank the Life ETX consortium, thanks to which we are here today in the context of the final and closing event of ETX. Indeed. Well, ETX didn't start thinking of the CBAM, to be fair, but it quickly became one of the main issues, or the main headaches out of the many. Well, the CBAM, again, I mentioned it earlier during the presentation. It is being discussed as more as an arguing point rather than an effective climate tool, which it is. Back when it was presented, once again, it was mostly a way to enable the phasing out of free allowances and a way to support and protect rather than support European industry. But we are happy to see that policymakers are seeing it more and more as a climate diplomacy instrument. This is what CMW thinks is the correct reasoning to push the CBAM. First thing, not to put too much pressure on the CBAM as a way, again, to protect the European industry. The European industry cannot rely on this climate policy to save itself in some sort of way. We need a concerted effort. But also, we strongly believe it has the potential to push and nudge other countries. We actually see it happening already. Maybe we have more chances during the panel to dwell into this, but it is having its effect already in enabling trade partners stepping up their climate ambitions. We know that, well, at the moment, the latest data we have is around 24% of global emissions are covered by carbon pricing of many sorts. But this is growing. We see much more interest from different countries. China and South Korea are both stepping up their efforts from the existing ETSs, and many more countries are interested in setting up starting setting up the monitoring system to eventually set up a carbon pricing system of themselves. And this, I believe, the main goal that the CBAM should have. So really, it's a trickle-down effect to all countries that the EU interacts with.
So basically, it sounds like a protectionism thing, but it's actually a way to make other parts of the world become more interested in expanding their ETS.
Hopefully, yes. Hopefully, yes. Of course, we have to communicate it correctly and we have to shape it correctly, making sure that the way it is implemented, which is a way to be defined, doesn't hinder some countries' efforts. Again, it shouldn't be disproportionately affecting some countries, but it should push them. Again, push their emission up. This is what we really hope that the CBAM will do.
And this is more a question for all of you. How do we reassure international trading partners instead of potentially starting a trade war with the whole CBAM? Whoever wants to take the first punch at this.
I think an important message is that there's a level playing field. Like there's no advantage, say, given to domestic producers. You know, when you come into Europe, you're getting taxed at the same level as domestic producers. So there's no advantage or disadvantage to anyone. I think that's an important point, that there is a level playing field.
And is there, or is that more a theoretical thing right now?
But at the minute, essentially there is. I think we'll probably touch on it later, but the cement industry receives pretty much all its carbon emissions for free because there's free allocations and there's no tax to the border. So from a cement industry perspective, today there's a level playing field. CBAM will introduce a carbon tax. Domestic producers will be taxed and people importing will be taxed. So from a cement perspective, there is a level playing field. And I think that's an important message. Like we're not disadvantaging importers versus domestic producers.
Sarah, go ahead.
While I think that's true, I don't think that it's necessarily perceived that way in a lot of EU's trade partner countries, especially because a lot of them, at least when we've been around, had workshops in Turkey and South Africa and some other countries on climate and trade, and a lot argue that the EU is already incentivizing low carbon industry and giving out a lot of subsidies, at least certain European countries, and giving a lot more help and has a lot more economic power to actually build up a decarbonized industry, while in Turkey they have super high interest rates, not as a strong currency, and maybe don't have as big of a domestic market to also, like, if you're a steel producer in South Africa and there's no demand for decarbonized steel in South Africa because it's too expensive, you can only export to the EU. So there might not be this same incentive in that way, and also not the economical resources. So I think that you have to combine the CBAM with also addressing this issue, which might not necessarily be within the scope of the CBAM, but can be done in other ways.
Romain, you work at the DG. How do you view this issue that's being raised by Sarah?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with most, if not all, that was said. If you're trying to conceive CBAM as a protectionist measure, or wonder if it's on the other end of the spectrum going to decarbonize the entire world, I think you need a bit of a clarification on what is the objective of the CBAM, and that is what Lidia has said from the beginning. The established aim of the CBAM is not to tell third countries, parties to all those international agreements on decarbonization, how they should achieve the emissions reductions. The aim is not to do the work for them, if I may say. The aim is to focus on the EU, on the EU's climate targets that we've adopted. I think we're one of the blocs in the world that is the most advanced on climate action and on setting out objectives to reach climate neutrality. We focus not only on EU productions, but we also want to look at the imported emissions. And that is exactly what the CBAM is doing, by saying exactly what Niall has said, by establishing a level playing field. We have the ETS, we are sort of imposing very strict carbon emissions measures on our industries, and the idea is to do no more, but no least, than exactly the same on third countries producers. And that is why they will feel exactly the same carbon price. At the moment, we have those free allowances in the ETS, which are going to fade out within 10 years. It's very slow, and it's also what we've seen in the presentation earlier. The impact of the CBAM at the start will be relatively slow. But gradually, we are aiming to replace carbon leakage instruments, which unfortunately does not help us cut emissions, by a different one that is going to help us enable reach climate neutrality. There will be an effect on third countries, certainly. This is something we're starting to see in all those international fora, and this is something we are discussing with the international partners. We see a very big uptake of carbon pricing since we've started discussions on CBAM. There's a carbon pricing club as well that was created. We are traveling quite a lot. There's been new development in China recently on how they can improve their own monitoring and reporting system and whether they should expand their carbon pricing instruments. We have the UK that is now saying we are also going to come up with a CBAM, and we hope it will be the first of a series. But the idea for us, and it also links somehow to the question of the revenues, is that we don't just want to collect revenues from those industries which produce emissions. We want to create a carbon incentive. So create a carbon price signal so that in countries such as South Africa, there will be an incentive to decarbonize. There will be a price signal that will create a need for those investments. And CBAM will be a success if one day we don't need CBAM anymore, because all the countries of the world has established a carbon pricing system. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
And I'm just wondering, does the rest of the world agree with you? I mean, are they all very happy to start thinking about introducing their own CBAM, or is there a lot of political and diplomatic pushback on this?
So that's taking up a lot of work. In our DG in the last year, we've traveled at quite a frenetic level to engage and discuss with those countries. My Director General, Gerasimos Thomas, he's been to the G20. He's participated, to G20 discussions. He's also had discussions within the OECD framework, the UNFCCC, WTO, of course, Climate Club, Energy Communities, all those forums where we actually discuss the CBAM. We've also had massive bilateral outreach. So he has traveled personally in the US at the World Bank to discuss the CBAM. He's had an Asia tour going to China, South Korea, Singapore, Japan. Recently, he went to Egypt, Turkey, and next in the list is India. So we're talking to all these big exporters of CBAM goods coming to the EU, and we have those engagements to tell them, to try and support them as well, how in our view they could develop their own carbon pricing system, and to convince them that the CBAM indeed is not a measure that we do to protect our industry. That I think if you look at the global stage, you will see other players which are taking protectionist measures, and there are news in this relations on how the EU reacts to that this week. But I don't think CBAM is one of them, because we are simply applying the equal equivalence, the same equivalence on the carbon price that we're doing.
And that actually brings me to a question for you, Niall. I can imagine that you, with low carbon cement production, have a certain view on CBAM, but how do your colleagues in the business look at this? Do they see it as actually a level playing field being created, or do they fear for their own business competitiveness?
Well, we've seen recently that Sembureau, who are the association that represent traditional cement producers across Europe, they've released statements saying that they welcome CBAM and they see it as a tool, not just for a level playing field between EU and non-EU suppliers, but also an instrument to decarbonize the cement industry. So it's been very welcomed, and I think we're actually in a great position. We have a policy here that promotes decarbonisation, and a policy that's accepted in the cement industry anyway. I think it's important now that we push ahead with this and ensure that it's implemented as planned. You know, I saw there in the earlier presentation about opportunities to review the ETS and review CBAM and all that. Like, I think for policymakers, when we're in a position like this where it's welcomed and it's accepted, that it's implemented in full and it's not diluted or delayed. Like as it stands, we're in the transition period now, until the end of 2025. So, you know, by what, 26, 27, 20, by 2028, only 10% of the free allowances will be removed, like, and 10% of the tax applied at the border. So it's a very gradual build up for CBAM. So it's important that we don't delay it, don't dilute it, and it's pushed ahead, particularly when it's welcomed by the industry.
Sarah, what do you see as risks for pushing ahead? Because it is going very slowly. And for me, it's difficult to understand why, if everybody is basically very happy with the CBAM. Maybe you can shed some light on that.
I don't think everyone is very happy with everything in the CBAM. I think there's still, as Amerique was also talking about before, some issues, and different industries have also pinpointed different issues within their specific cases. And it's also within a broader framework of all EU policies, not only the CBAM. And I think what we heard here is, thank you for this very interesting report, because it really pinpoints some issues that we've been thinking about as well, which is especially that this could go several ways, and nobody really knows yet because we don't have any data on what will happen. We can only forecast. But I think for EU producers, you can either see that we get, well, that greener or more decarbonized products get a larger market share within the EU if the system is, if they're covered by the CBAM, but you could also see that the prices go up for the EU industries that use those products. And a lot of those products are key in the decarbonization of the whole system. So I think you had some examples as well, but for example, wind power plants use a lot of steel. Electric vehicles also use a lot of the products in the CBAM, but even like washing machines, household appliances, there are loads of products that include a very high share of CBAM goods. And the question is, if they're not protected, but they still have to pay a large or a higher price for all this, will those industries just move outside of the EU, or will the European consumer have to pay a much higher price inside the EU for these products? So I think that's an issue that will be upcoming, and I think also the Commission is now looking at including products that are further down the value chain, so that will be interesting to keep an eye out for.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, my own panelists and Sarah for this latest remark. Just to react really quickly, and maybe this was already mentioned, we keep making the mistake, myself included, of referring to European industry as a monolithic entity, which is not the case, and this is especially true if we're talking about ETS and CBAM. We have some sectors that historically have received insanely high amount of free allowances and have banked them, and they keep being covered for the majority of their emissions by free allocation. The latest data maybe is not out yet, but the data from 2022 is that sectors at risk of carbon leakage still pay for around only 10% of their emission, and this could, for the 2023, the figure could be even worse because we see a decrease in production. So that means that they may have not paid at all for their CO2 emission. And at the same time, we have sectors that are fully or almost fully exposed to the carbon price, and maybe these sectors will also pay the price of an increased price for products that they use for their production, because these products will be covered by the CBAM. And so basically some sectors will be exposed to multiple price increases and taxes and levies, while others keep benefiting from systems that allow incumbents to, well, maintain the status quo, which is less than ideal, to say the least. And of course, there's multiple moves that needs to be taken to tackle this. But one thing that I think needs to be pointed out is we still refer, like all this reasoning starts from one concept, the one of carbon leakage. And we urge, as Carbon Market Watch policymakers, to investigate further into the matter, because we have, of course, the carbon leakage list gets updated, but still pretty extensive. And do we have the data that allow us to really back what we are all the things that we're doing to prevent carbon leakage? Is it happening? To what extent is it happening? For whom is it happening? Because we have now decided that for some sector it's happening, for some sector it is not, or it is happening to a very limited extent. Let's just make sure that we do not, again, refer to all European industry as the same, because some are benefiting from the last 2 decades of policies and some are not.
Maybe in 1 second, I mean, just to complement, I mean, the CBAM it's a liberal market-driven system, right? It's about establishing a level playing field, rewarding those who decarbonize, those who take actions, who invest into greening their production. It gives them a financial incentives, and those who don't, well, they have a financial incentive to improve and get better. But I think this is what industry should be calling for now. A level playing field, equality in how they progress. We want climate action, but we recognize that only companies and producers are the ones who will have the final word for it. And I think asking for production for protection is not going to help out industries in the end, because it forces the signal that they have to decarbonize. And if they don't do it, there will be other measures taken, probably more how can I say, socialistic, more state-driven, to tell them how to do it and when. So in my view, the liberal way should be what companies would prefer.
Before we move on to the questions from the audience, there's still one point that I would like to address, and that is the use of CBAM revenues. The regulation only states that revenues will go to the EU budget. Is there clarity on how they will be spent? Just a general question for all of you.
Maybe I can get a kickstart just to present the basics. I mean, before we can spend revenues, we need to collect the revenues. That will start in 2026. The adjustments will be very slow at the beginning because of free allowances, which decreasing very slowly. It starts with 2.5% of allowances being on the market. The rest is auctioned for free. So we're talking about revenues which will be very slow to arrive, take time. And at the moment, we haven't even agreed on where the revenue will land, in which pockets. That's probably inner discussions in Brussels, typical fights between the member states and the European Commission. We have proposed that 75% of the revenue will be going to the Commission as own resources. The next generation EU and the debt it has created is no stranger to that. It's quite clear where we would like that revenue to go. And the remaining 25% would go to member states because they have a lot of costs as well. They've established national competent authorities who will administer the review of the declaration, get in touch with all the importers, do this sort of work, and implement it also at the borders. So that's the state of play, but the own resource decision is still under negotiations. Most likely there will be an MFF discussions in 2027 that will solve that issue. But yeah, before discussing how to spend it, I think we have first to get some money.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick point on the revenue. Obviously, CBAM is going to create a market for it. From the cement industry's perspective, it's going to create a market for low carbon cement and low carbon cement solutions. And to Lydia's point about the free allowances, that's going to be the biggest impact on the cement industry. Since the start of the ETS, they've had 2 decades where they've paid virtually nothing for carbon emissions. And now we're going to see them exposed to carbon emissions. And that's going to create a demand, like a market for low carbon solutions. And there's companies out there like ourselves who have solutions and we need to bring them to market. And that needs support. You know, cement is a heavy industry, it's a costly industry, and to bring solutions on an industrial scale to market is going to be expensive. And we need these products in the market to meet the demand that CBAM creates and also to reap the benefits that such a policy or legislation creates. So I think it's important as well to also support and embrace the companies who are bringing through these new waves of solutions.
Yeah, so you have a clear path of where the revenues should go. Yeah.
Some of that. Yeah.
And Sarah, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about where the revenues will come from, who will actually bear the cost of the CBAM. So in some cases, it may be the EU producers, in some cases, it may be the EU consumers, and in some cases, it may be the countries that are exporting to the EU. And that also plays into where these, if we, in a hypothetical scenario, we can decide by ourselves where the revenues go, where to place them. And I think one aspect of the EU ETS is that part of the revenues goes back to also helping European industry decarbonize through various funds. And I think there would be a large interest in also making that available for countries outside of the EU using the CBAM revenues as a sort of framework of also giving that money back in some way.
Thanks for the point on giving the money back. Indeed, this is a pretty big one. We need to collect the revenues first and then think how to spend it. True, from a very pragmatic standpoint. I think that one point of the revenues is very much, not very much, but is a narrative point. Indeed, we are not talking about huge amounts for the moment. This may change, that depends on the carbon price, that depends on the potential expansion to further sectors down the line. But it is important to show once again that if this is not a protectionist measure, then the EU is willing to spend this money elsewhere and to spend it especially in the country that will be mostly affected. They need support in their own industrial and energy transition. Spending it within the EU borders and for EU industry is not really an option for WTO reasons, for non-discrimination purposes that will be really hard to defend at a WTO level. Whereas spending it in vulnerable economies, well, maybe also not only in their industrial transition, but beyond that, in their transformation at large, could be a winning solution. And this is a further point actually for fostering carbon pricing beyond the EU borders. They get to keep the revenues for themselves and spend it as they see most fit. So this is another point that I think should be highlighted when doing the outreach work, indeed.
Thank you for that. We are now turning to our audience for questions. Oh, this sound is really terrible. Just a second. There have been questions sent in online, but let's take the first question from the room. And yes, you, sir, I saw you first. Yes, I will bring the mic to you.
Yes, hi, my name is Tobias Larsson. I represent a company called CBAM, who helps companies to comply with the regulation. And I think one topic that maybe wasn't discussed in the panel is about the ease of compliance and you know the work that companies have to go through, the importers, to actually comply and reach out to their supply chain. In some cases, 2 tiers, you know, the precursors are also included. And that there's been some reports on that there's not, you know, the submission of declarations has been quite low. So maybe to get sort of panel's view on this and where the regulation is heading in that regard.
All right, compliance. Who wants to do the first one? Not all at once. Romain?
Just to clarify, your question was about actual values, reporting of actual values. In that context, okay. Maybe it's a good opportunity to take a bit stocks about the submissions of reports. So we've had already 2 periods where we've been asking importers to submit CBAM reports during the transitional period until the end of 2025. Basically, every quarter, we're asking importers to submit a report, and that's because we need data, we need values in order to prepare for the definitive period, or the period that comes starting from 2026, where we'll be adopting the final default values that we will use in case third countries operators do not want or not interested in calculating the actual emissions. They can rely on those values. So we've had two periods for the reporting. In January and in April, we've been asking reporting declarants to submit their reports. For each of these periods, we've received around 16,000 reports, which is not what I would say low. Actually, in fact, from a compliance perspective, it's a lot of reports that we have the Commission duty to look into, check whether they are complete, who has not achieved their duty to report, and we've started communicating to EU member states actually the list of those declarants who are not aware, or at least who have not submitted their quarterly CBAM reports, so that they can take it to the next steps and engage with those declarants to inform them of their responsibility to report. And this is all done with the view to be 100% ready on the 1st of January 2026, where at the time the stakes will be much higher because there will be a financial adjustment. It is correct that the reporting of actual values has been relatively low since October when we launched the CBAM. This is expected, I think, because of course, reporting declarants from the start of the CBAM, we are taking things slowly. We want to get them used to the registry, to the reporting methodology, and so on. So we are allowing them to report on the basis of default values that the Commission has provided to them. We don't get any quality data on that, but of course, it achieves other benefits. That will slowly slow and be stopped because, as we write in the CBAM regulation, actually, the point of the transition period, one of the objectives is to collect the real values. So we need operators in third countries to do the exercise of reporting the actual values. And from 2026 onwards, they will have to report on the basis of actual values and have those emissions verified, or they will be able to pick default values, which actually will include a markup in order to incentivize them to actually do that. There's one sector actually that has been pretty good at reporting actual values, and that is the cement sectors. Maybe you can tell us, Neil, about what that is. I think it's quite interesting, but most likely from October onwards, we are expecting a lot more reporting on the basis of actual values.
Just in terms of compliance, just a quick comment from my own experience is that in terms of planning, like as a company, like we don't look at like next year or the following year, we look like 5-10 years ahead when we plan. And one issue that arose for us is trying to actually calculate what the tax will be, or like, I know it depends on the carbon price and so on, but like the actual structure of how you calculate it, it's not been easy to figure it out. And we've talked to many different people and got a range of values, but cement is a low cost commodity, like a change of a few euro here and there, like, you know, in terms of based on just a simple calculation can have a big impact. In terms of cement and imports, interesting thing about cement is that it's as an importer, like on the grand scheme of things, it's not a massive thing for cement. Cement's quite a local product, so it's only distributed generally 300-400 kilometers from where it's produced. I think last year, cement was a net exporter of like 2 million tons, about 1% of the total EU market. So maybe we have a lower volume of to deal with, a little easier maybe.
Let's do a question from the online audience now. To all panelists, is there a need to develop and detail the concept of force majeure or extraordinary economic circumstances further in the relevant secondary CBAM legislation? I must admit, I don't know what I just said, but I do think that you know. The rest of the question is, should it apply to specific third countries and sets of circumstances? Who wants to take the mic?
Quickly react. Well, I think the expedient of the force majeure clause has been used historically under the EU ETS rule as a way to escape established rules. So it, again, is force majeure. So it's really should apply in extreme cases. Yes, indeed, in the past few years, we have witnessed some extreme cases. We have had COVID. There was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, I think what happened recently within the ETS can serve as an example of relying too much on these clauses and trying to escape what has been established. I'm thinking, for example, the front-loading of allowances due to REPowerEU related decisions that have brought to a dip in the carbon prices just a few months after. So I will let Roger maybe speak, but I don't think there is a need at the moment for force majeure clauses to be implemented. At the same time, if there's a question on specific third countries, my question actually that I asked Romain is, do you think we could think of exemptions for vulnerable economies rather than force majeure clauses? And of course, limited in time and limited in scope, but do you think that's an option?
So if we talk about third countries, the regulation says that in principle there are no exemptions. All third countries are concerned about CBAM, except those countries which apply the EU ETS. So there's a number of them which are included in an annex of the CBAM regulation. Of course, if they are subject to exactly the same carbon price that we have, it would make no sense to ask them to apply the CBAM. There's another, I wouldn't call it exemptions, but facility is that in any event, whenever a carbon price is paid in third countries, this will be reflected into a corresponding reduction of the CBAM obligation. So that leads to the question of whether force majeure or anything is needed beyond those two provisions. And we actually have a third one in the CBAM regulation. From the top of my head, I think it's Article 30, paragraph 7, which mentions in case of an extreme event leading to the economic destruction of a country, then by way of reports, which may be accompanied by Commission's proposal, then there might be a way to cover for derogations or exemptions from the CBAM regulation. I think we might all be able to think of at least one country which could qualify for those criteria, but at the moment we haven't received any requests from any countries to start working on triggering these provisions, which would be a long way again because it requires a legislative proposal. And in any event, some countries in the world which are at the proximity of the EU, such as energy community members, can also work on other ways to link up to the ETS rather than thinking about derogation. So that might be part of the thinking as well.
Let's take another question from the room. Oh, I see a lot of hands. This is going to be... I saw you at the first round with the question, so I'm going to go to you.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Sabine from Carbon Market Watch. I think I have 3 questions, but I'll try and be brief. The first one is, where do we stand on the thorny issue of export rebates? Both Romain and Niall, you invoked the level playing field, but there are companies in the EU who claim that the field will not be level for them. They will be disadvantaged with their exports. Niall, you mentioned Semburo welcoming the CBAM, but if I'm not mistaken, Semburo was also amongst those calling for export rebates. The Commission has ruled export rebates out so far, but has nevertheless said it will look at solutions to the problem. I don't know where those solutions now stand. Secondly, WTO, the accusation that CBAM is a protectionist instrument has actually been taken to its ultimate consequence. Some countries have challenged CBAM in the WTO. I personally was surprised because the WTO is not currently a fully functioning body, so I wonder how we have to interpret this as a tactic. Does it serve to extract more concessions from the EU for financial and technical assistance in achieving decarbonisation in our trading partners? And finally, I read on the issue of what represents an effective carbon price applied in the countries from which imports come into the EU. I read that India is trying to do something really clever, and that is to just impose a tax on exports from India, so not to apply a carbon price across the relevant sectors of the economy, but just on exports in order to keep the money within India. Does that have a chance of qualifying in EU terms?
Well, you just asked enough questions for a full panel. So I'm going to ask you, which question is your favorite? Because they're going to answer that one.
Okay, I'll choose the second one on, what did I say, on the concessions, or on how to interpret this, the complaint to the WTO. What are the countries trying to achieve and how might the EU respond?
I see people opening their mouths. Who wants to go first?
I don't know. I definitely don't know what they're trying to achieve, but I think some countries have a very strong, and maybe especially South Africa, who I think filed the complaint at the WTO or is planning to, that there's a very strong feeling of just, we're not going to accept this. Like, no matter what, we are going to work against the CBAM. We're not going to try to adjust to the CBAM yet. I think there's maybe some companies or some specific industries that might be trying to comply and trying to push for a higher carbon price so that they can, keep more in the country. But the general consensus, at least when we were there and talking to different stakeholders, was this we cannot accept. So just we're going to do everything in our power to work against it. So that may be one feeling, and maybe based on also that they have a limited possibility to decarbonize a lot of their sectors, since they're dependent on the electricity grid, which is not working very well in South Africa specifically. So I don't know if that answers your question, but just a thought. Anyone else?
Go ahead. So it's very easy to think how to understand the EU if you. Oh, okay, I'm a lawyer. If you look at the treaties, and there's this specific provision in the treaties which says that the EU believes in multilateralism and that it will respect all international treaties that it has signed. And maybe this is the one provision that has led to the CBAM being a bit particular. Why are we asking those third countries producers to calculate exactly the emissions that they have? Why do we care so much about putting an adjustment that exactly reflect what they have emitted and that exactly reflect what there is in the EU? And that reason is WTO. And the WTO has played such an important part in the design of the CBAM that it is an understatement to say that we are concerned about the WTO risk. Actually, we consider that the CBAM is completely compatible with WTO, and this is one of the stance we've taken to third countries. There are countries which are doubtful about whether it is indeed completely symmetrical, completely identical, the ETS adjustments compared to the WTO one, and they have voiced those concerns. At the moment, I'm not aware of any WTO litigation that has been sent into the EU. So probably those countries are looking at the matter, and it is an effort for us as well to explain how the CBAM is designed and why we think it's it's compatible. But whatever we do will be driven by the respect of international law. And if you think about it, it's a bit like if in a third country's constitution you would write that you're placing international law at the same level as your law, and that is what we do at the EU. So it's something we have quite a high confidence about. And when we hear about those third countries thinking about an export tax and claiming that it might be comparable to actually a carbon price, it's something we are going to look into, of course. But in our legislation, we've been careful to somehow define the carbon price. We say it has to be effectively paid, and it needs to be a carbon price. So a carbon tax for exports is probably first not going to be compliant with WTO rules, but of course we have to read what will be presented. And secondly, it's a really open question: is it a carbon price or not? And that is something we will have to look at. And for the export rebate, as you say, we have not ruled it out, but we are looking into the problems. I'm not sure what more I could say on this.
Just very quickly on the export rebate, we're actually not a member of Sembureau ourselves, so I don't speak for Sembureau, but I think on a whole they welcome the general policy of CBAM, and they've raised issues in many areas, like fraudulent reporting of cement coming in at the border. So, but these are issues that need to be worked through. And I mentioned earlier that Europe was a net exporter of 2 million tons, so their exports were about 9 million tons last year out of Europe, and that's in a market of about 180 million tons a year. So it is an issue. It needs I'm sure Sembureau are working to find solutions, but I think the general principle of the phase out of free allowances, I think, is accepted and welcomed. So, and that's a massive positive.
We're taking another question from the online audience. How quickly can or should the CBAM mechanism be changed to include more products? For example, you have the CBAM on hydrogen, but not products that use hydrogen as a raw material. Very interesting road to take. Who wants to go first?
Because I quickly mentioned it during my presentation, there is a first report on the possible expansion to more downstream products, actually due pretty soon. And then 2 opportunities for amendments, technical and then policy amendments. So that's foreseen. But of course, those amendments wouldn't, I'm sure, apply already from 2026. But then again, we have someone in the panel that's more, yeah. To reply to this.
In the title of your event, you say ETS and CBAM after European elections. I would like to argue the elections are still ongoing, and there are still more things to go. We have political masters which need to be appointed, so that can be probably part of the answer, and that will probably also influence our planning for whatever comes from now on. I mean, whatever our plans for 2025, there will be a new commission, there will be new political priorities, and everything is dependent on that. Now, there's one element of certainty, is that by the end of 2025, the Commission will produce a report looking at the transitional period, at the impact it has had, and at the possibility of expanding it maybe to other sectors. We've said it, and it's also written in the legislation that first, the expansion could arrive by 2030 in terms of entering into force, and that we will prioritize first the sectors the most at risk of carbon leakage, and that also is quite specified in a list. So it's not a secret. What will it be? Which sectors it will be, and what emissions? Is it only direct emissions, indirect emissions, and so on? Is going to be subject to a very thorough assessment, and that's what we're doing actually. On top of implementing the CBAM for the transitional period, we're also looking at implementing it during the definitive period, and also thirdly at expanding it possibly. But someone has to correct the numbers, and that takes time.
Yes, Yes, we understand the warning. We should be patient. We have, if everybody is sort of brief, we have room for 2 more questions. One from the audience. I'm going to go to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I was in Bangkok a few weeks ago for the Future Energy Asia meeting, and I can say there was a lot of discussion about CBAM, and generally it was seen as an industrial competitiveness issue. And it's a little bit of a throwaway remark, but many of the countries present were saying that they're considering introducing their own CBAM. So I'm wondering, are you going to do some scenario work on the impact of, say, CBAMs in Asia on the economy of exports from Europe and things like that? And the other issue is that in the carbon accounting, it's not just carbon, because in many cases there's the issue of impact on the environment in terms of biodiversity, natural capital, the EU deforestation regulation, etc. And this introduces a whole other level of complexity in the reporting, especially when you're talking about reporting from smallholder farmers that are providing biomass for the production of sustainable biofuels. So has there been a consideration of this, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of reporting abroad in the work that you're doing on CBAM?
Thank you. Sarah.
Quickly on the last point you mentioned on all the other regulations that countries outside of the EU are also being subject to now, I think maybe in that whole group of regulations, sometimes CBAM gets a bad rep because of the other ones, because CBAM, I think DG TAXUD has done a lot more work, in some cases at least, on having a transitional period and allowing for exceptions and flexibility in the beginning, and also doing outreach. And while for producers in these countries or legislators, that comes as a whole package, so you don't necessarily see the work that is done on the CBAM, but you just see, oh, here's this deforestation and this one and this one. So I would encourage all of those to do more work on that as well. Regarding having CBAMs, lots of different CBAMs, I think there's 2 aspects to it. One is that it may be good for the EU low carbon or decarbonized industry if there is actually a CBAM in other countries, because that would make their exports more competitive. But we also need to think about having all these CBAMs and how, if we have, the UK has their consultation closes today, I think, is already a little bit different than the EU CBAM. If we have other countries, the US is thinking about different measures, theirs will look completely different because they don't have a carbon price. So if we have all these different systems, there needs to be some form to not have producers that have a global exports to have to comply to a million different systems, because that just feels very unnecessary. So that was all.
Yes, and then we get to our final question from our online audience. That's actually for you now. The free allowances are now given per ton of clinker produced. So is there an incentive to keep clinker ratios in cement high? Do you foresee changes in cement industry's behavior as more free allowances are taken away by CBAM?
So we've seen, if I'll give you a good example, is if you take 1 ton of cement, over the last 30 years, the carbon intensity of 1 ton of cement has reduced on average by about 0.6% per annum. So there's been very small incremental changes in the carbon intensity of cement. And through that period, the amount of clinker, which is the raw material that is used to make cement, and where about 90% of the emissions come from, has remained relatively constant. And there's a financial incentive within the current ETS the ETS isn't based on cement volumes, it's based on clinker volumes. And the clinker is a component of cement. And all the CO2 comes from the clinker. And there's been an incentive since they started the ETS to maintain, well, particularly now in the current phase, where they look back at your historic production versus, you know, your average production for the last 2 years, there's an incentive to keep your clinker volumes high to make sure you maximize your free allocation. But that's the good thing about CBAM, is it's going to start removing free allowances. So there will come a tipping point for the cement industry where maximizing their free allowances is worth less than reducing their carbon emissions. And, you know, I think the phase out of free allowances is really going to be a turning point for the cement industry. We've seen other sectors like the energy sector where taxing of carbon has created change and quick change. And I think it's the removal of free allowances we're going to see similar in the cement industry.
Well, thank you for that. I can probably speak for all the panelists that the removal of free allowances in any sector would be a great idea. I think that wraps up our panel for today on the CBAM. I would like to thank all of our expert guests for you to be here. I, for one, have learned a lot, and I hope that everybody here in the room and online can say the same. Just some housekeeping messages. A video recording of this panel will be made accessible soon. And if you have any questions for us or for any of our guests today, you can just send them to us and we will make sure that they arrive at the right person. I would also like to thank everybody in the audience. Thank you for participating and for your patience with some of the technical issues that we had. I wish you all a lovely lunch break. Everybody who has registered that wants to go for lunch can go to the rooftop, but also if you haven't registered, but you do want to stick around for the second panel that starts at 2, you can still register with Gemma, I heard, and then have a lovely lunch, and then we can see you all here at 2 o'clock sharp. So thank you, and we will see you in an hour.